Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series examining the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode number 21 for Sunday the 19th of November 2017, and today's episode is Supplementary 2, The Ones That Got Away, Part 1, in which we'll look at 11 movies that, whilst inspired by true events, didn't quite keep close enough to the facts for us to dedicate an episode to them. We'll also mention a few historical figures and events that definitely warrant a movie being made, but for some reason one hasn't been yet, or if it has, it's escaped our attention. My name is Martin Darlington, and today I'm flying solo as co-host Andrew is away on a course. He's overseas, so I'm afraid for today it's just me. Errata updates and news. Surprisingly, we haven't made any errors that any of you have noticed recently. We would like to draw listeners' attention, though, to a relatively new podcast series which is covering the US Civil War, obviously on the back of us covering the film Glory a couple of episodes ago. This is being done from an incredibly fresh perspective. It's hosted by Jack Hitt and Chenjerai Kumanyika. The production standards of them are like a proper television broadcast network. They go on location, they interview academics, museum curators, and descendants of Civil War protagonists. The show is called Uncivil. Their website is uncivil.show. It can be found on iTunes and all the other usual outlets, SoundCloud, Podbean. But if you subscribe to the show on TuneIn, on their app, you also get each week's episode early. It's completely free. And they're looking at the Civil War from an African-American viewpoint, but it gives a much more balanced viewpoint. It's obvious that the US Civil War to Americans is a very emotive subject, and some listeners may not agree with all their conclusions because historical interpretation is so subjective, but it's so unusual and refreshing to hear another side to the story, and it often involves stories that I've never heard before, and I've studied the period to a degree, certainly not in any great depth, but their mission, in their own words, is to ransack the official version. And basically what they're doing is ripping apart an awful lot of myths surrounding the Civil War and its aftermath, and of course, very relevantly, its legacy today. So we highly recommend it. We're also finding ourselves, and this is hugely down to Tom Secker and his Clandestine series, a lot of Tom's, or some of Tom's podcast episodes are not about necessarily the entertainment industry or popular culture, but a lot are, and he's dedicated quite a lot of episodes to the CIA and Hollywood, and also looking at the Pentagon's relationship with Hollywood. And one of the things that Tom does is he really looks at why a story's been changed, why this particular actor was cast, why they've asked for this change or that change. He does an awful lot of work under the Freedom of Information Act in America, being sent various details of different films and government involvement. I find myself naturally now asking myself, okay, they've changed that, but why? And some will still be inexplicable. For example, Glory having all the black characters in the regiment being fictional, when they were perfectly good, heroic, real individuals. William Carney standing on the walls of Fort Wagner, waving the colours, is one that springs to mind. It may be that they were spread across different companies. They wanted to put them into the same company. I don't know. But certainly with looking back to episode 1 and Gladiator, the reason that they had Marcus Aurelius changing his legacy to try and re-empower the Senate and the people of Rome, which is two very separate groups, I think that's clearly because they want us to be sympathetic towards Marcus Aurelius, and therefore he has to be a promoter of democracy, because that's what most of us watching that film live under. Anyway, enough of that. On to some listener feedback, and this is from dear listener and history teacher in Australia, Susan Jones. Susan wrote and he said, "I'm sorry it's taken for me to now to thank you for the way you responded to my request for more diversity. I was nervous about contacting you originally. After all, you're providing us with this excellent free entertainment, and here I was asking you to do it differently. Also, the accidental erasure of women and deliberate sexism is so prevalent that quite honestly, it gets tiring asking to be heard, and it's worse when there's pushback. So I really appreciate the way you responded to me, and wanted you to know that your reaction has helped me feel that asking to be heard is worth the risk. So thank you both so much. Susan goes on, and I'm always a little bit, I don't know, it sounds dreadfully self-promoting to read out an email where someone says how great we are, but basically Susan's saying how great we are. She likes the range of films and protagonists we've covered. She's said never apologise for going into technical detail. She was fascinated by the information on Deepwater Horizon and Apollo 13. And she did mention she loves podcasts and originally tried to be omnivorous when it came to subject matter, but there's so many great history ones that it's a struggle to keep up. And Susan, I'm finding that myself. I've had to trim a couple out from my listening because I keep discovering things like Uncivil. She goes on to say that the Pocahontas episode nearly made her cry, and she drew parallels between Pocahontas' real story and Truganini's. Now, I have to admit, when I read this, I'd never heard of Truganini, so I had a look, and Truganini was a Tasmanian Aboriginal lady who lived in the mid-1800s and was treated by the British settlers in a very similar way to Pocahontas by the British settlers. And Susan does make a suggestion, Paradise Road. Now, that rang a bell, and I thought, I think it's Glenn Close, and it is, but I couldn't for the life of me remember what the subject matter was. Andrew immediately recognised it and went, that's fantastic. And it's about a group of Allied women, Allied as in American, Australian, British, captured by the Japanese in the Second World War, and they form a singing group to keep themselves sane. And immediately you start looking into it, you realise that there's actually things the film doesn't cover that are worth going into, so that's definitely on the list. And just a final point on Truganini. Her story bears a striking resemblance to that of Pocahontas, so if any Disney producers are listening, don't bother, okay? Just you stick to Snow White, alright? And we've had a review by Susan. It's Susan Jones again, I assume, because it's in Australia, and she's given us 5 stars and said engrossing, enlightening and entertaining, and she basically just summarises what we do, speculating why filmmakers diverge from source material in service to the story as a result of the era of the film, and she praises us for the amount of research we do. And I have to say, that's what I love about this. Even if there was only Susan and Jacob Morrison listening to us, and Gary Shavit and Mark Jackson and our other dear listeners, but I'm not too fussed because it doesn't really cost us much except for buying books, and bought books all my life. The research is what makes it fantastic. I'm finding out things that I never knew. Anyway, I've gone on enough, so without further ado, he says after 9 minutes and 45 seconds, the first film we're going to look at is very much in line with recent films we've been covering, like Hidden Figures, Selma, and especially Glory. And this is 1939's Gone with the Wind. Very brief synopsis. It stars Clark Gable as Rhett Butler and Vivian Leigh as Scarlett O'Hara in Civil War Georgia. It's one of the most successful movies of all time. It's been criticised for glorifying slavery, yet at the same time it receives praise for casting African Americans, and Hattie McDonald, who played Mammy, the housemaid on the plantation Tara, where Scarlett O'Hara lives, she was the first black woman to get a Best Supporting Actress Oscar. In fact, the first black actor to get an Academy Award. Having said that, Hattie McDonald's acting skills can't be doubted. Her portrayal of Mammy, however, created a stereotypical image of a jolly African-American lady who wholeheartedly enjoyed serving her white family, the family that enslaved and owned her. And this cultural stereotype, it still exists today. Gone with the Wind may not be the only movie to portray this kind of character, but it is definitely one of the most important to do so. And we go back to what we're talking about, popular culture, and how these feelings and images and impressions get under our skin. Overall, the movie received 8 Oscars plus 2 honorary awards, and adjusting for monetary inflation, it remains the most profitable film ever made. So the reality of what's portrayed in the film is why we can't really cover it, because all the main characters and the plantation on which Scarlett O'Hara lives, Tara, the plantation, they are all fictional. There are events of the Civil War that receive references, such as the defeat of the Confederacy at Gettysburg, the Siege of Atlanta, General Sherman's march through Virginia, but they're not the main focus. And one thing that the movie can definitely be held responsible for is a romanticisation of the Old South. The opening scenes see a script overlay that rolls whilst the choir hums Dixie. And I'm afraid I'm going to probably butcher this, but I'm going to have a go. So here is my attempt at reading what the scroll says. There was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and of slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind. Remember back to Supplementary 1, where we did music in the movies and we talked about how your emotions are manipulated by the use of music and how your sympathies can be guided? Let's just hear that again, because in the film there's no voice, just some text appearing on the screen that you read. What you do get is what you're about to hear in the background. So let's just have a listen again. There was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and of slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind. Now, I do have to say at this stage, I quite understand that there will be thousands and thousands of good, decent people who live in the southern states, who are not racist, who don't wish for the return of slavery or believe in white supremacy or any of that nonsense, who might hear that tune, Dixie, and it might bring a sigh and a whisper of nostalgia because they're remembering that tune being associated with their childhood, where they grew up, and their friends and their family. And that's perfectly normal and not something that I'm certainly trying to condemn. However, it's a little bit like me reading about British military history and the building of the empire. We can't pretend that this thing that makes us feel wistfully nostalgic was born out of something noble or correct or right or honourable. Basically, the British Empire and the southern states' adherence to slavery are born out of the same thing. It's down to profit. It's a profitable business, conquering an empire and taking everyone's natural resources, just as it is when you run a cotton or tobacco plantation and you don't actually have to pay your workforce, just feed and clothe them. So I do think that people need to keep that in mind when they're looking at the things that represent what they feel is their culture. Now, the tune itself, Dixie, is worth a little bit of examination. Now, I just assumed that it was written probably during the Civil War, maybe just before it, and by a Southern Confederate supporter. And have I got news for you? Because it turns out, and I've only just learnt this by listening to the latest episode of Uncivil, the podcast I told you about earlier, it was actually written, well, the official credit for it is it was written by a musical performer called Daniel Emmett, who performed in a minstrel show Now, British listeners of a similar age to myself may well remember the black and white minstrel show on British TV in the 70s, where white singers would blacken their faces and perform songs pretending to be black singers. You're absolutely right, it does make you wince, doesn't it? But this was back in the 1850s, and Daniel Emmett was a Yankee. He was a New Yorker, or he lived in New York, and he performed this song in Manhattan, and it took off. And all the stuff about, I'll live and die in Dixie, that's where I'll make my stand, really appealed to the nascent Confederacy states. But thanks to Chenjerai Kumanyika and Jack Hitt's research, I've learned that Emmett actually came from a place called Mount Vernon in Ohio, and his grandparents lived next door to a family of musicians. And they believe, and it's fairly well established, that this song already existed, and he learnt it from this family of musicians who were called the Snowdens, and they were black. So the tune most associated with the Confederate South and was sung and played at the recent white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was actually named the Dixie Freedom Rally. Obviously Dixie in that case referring to the southern states rather than just the tune. Sorry, I've got a cat trying to destroy furniture. Can you stop that? Thank you. I'm talking to some friends. Alright? I should probably edit that out. It might be that the song Dixie was actually written by a black family. Go figure, huh? And there's also another myth about the Confederacy. There's a scene in Gone with the Wind, and it's quite a famous scene, where the camera cuts back. Scarlett's walking through looking for a doctor because her sister-in-law, I think it is about to give birth. And she walks through a rail yard full of dead and wounded Confederate soldiers. And the camera pans back, and there's a Confederate flag in the foreground flapping in the wind, and it looks a bit tattered and battle-stained. This is the Confederate flag that exists today, but it was actually never the official flag of the Confederacy, of which there were a number at different stages. The official flag bore a striking resemblance to the Stars and Stripes, to Old Glory, which was used by the Union Army. So General Beauregard, who you may remember from our Glory episode, he was the commanding general opposing the Union troops. He took a design that we now know as the Confederate flag as a battle flag, so his men would not become confused. And its use in Gone with the Wind is credited to a large degree with the almost universal belief that that was the Confederate flag. So yet again, we're buying into a legend that has been put into our consciousness by popular culture. Now, Margaret Mitchell, who wrote the novel Gone with the Wind, was published in 1936. It's the only novel she published during her life. She was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, amongst many veterans of the Civil War in the early 20th century. She knew both military veterans and the civilians who'd lived through the war in and around Atlanta. And she admits that until about age 10, she had no idea that General Lee had even lost the war, and she found it quite a shock. She became steeped in romantic, nostalgic ideas about what the South had been like before the war, and this does come through in a novel, just as in the movie, as kind of longing after a lost golden age. In the movie, there's also reference, and Margaret Mitchell makes scathing reference to carpetbaggers. Now, I assumed this was a sort of term for some form of criminal, but it turns out that a carpetbagger was someone who was basically emigrating from one part of the Americas to the other, and they'd take all their possessions in a carpet bag, hence the name. And this implication was that they're not just visiting, they're actually moving to stay. In the South, it is a very derogatory term. They're portrayed as lowlifes, con artists, scoundrels, looking to basically take advantage of the impoverished South that had just been defeated and rip anything of value out of it. Many texts from the Union sources say that quite the opposite. They were mainly educated, well-to-do, and very keen to ensure the revival of the South, but keen that this revival must include the newly freed African Americans as equal partners. In reality, I've no doubt that there were plenty of the former type and plenty of the latter, so it's not something that I'm going to go into great depth here, and I have spent far too long already on this first of 11 films, so I will move on. Final thing I'm going to say is an urban myth exists about the last words spoken in the movie. because the words everyone remembers were actually just the last words said by Clark Gable's character, Rhett Butler. And we can hear those now.
Rhett, you go. Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Whereas, in actual fact, the last words said in the movie were by Scarlett O'Hara, and they were...
After all, tomorrow is another day.
And yeah, just to finish, I do have to say that the soundtrack, the theme music, is a glorious piece of music which, in isolation, without any connotations or deep meaning, is actually a beautiful piece of music. Okay, so that's number one, Gone with the Wind. Now, number two is actually two films. We're going to look at two films about Vietnam. The 79 Apocalypse Now and 1986's Platoon. Apocalypse Now, the brief outline is Captain Willard, played by Martin Sheen, some kind of special forces operative. He's tasked to travel into Cambodia, find a special forces commander, Colonel Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando, who's gone rogue, and terminate him. In an increasingly bizarre journey, Willard encounters Colonel Kilgore, played by Robert Duvall, an air cavalry commander obsessed with surfing, and whose helicopter gunships play Ride of the Valkyries through loudspeakers as they attack Vietnamese villages. This, you may well remember, was featured in our Supplementary 1, Music in the Movies. Platoon also featured in that for the use of Samuel Barber's music, which was used during the death of Sergeant Elias, played by Willem Dafoe. And the film centres around a volunteer, Chris Taylor, who left university and volunteered to fight, but his idealism quickly fades as he realises the futility of how the war is being conducted. And this isn't helped by infighting in his own unit, where the aforementioned Sergeant Elias, played by Willem Dafoe, is at loggerheads with Staff Sergeant Barnes, played by Tom Berenger, who plays a pretty tough, evil dude. And they clash over how to interact with the local population. Barnes wants to kill them all. Elias is a bit more balanced. Looking at the background to it, Apocalypse Now has become a bit of a cult classic. It was based on a Joseph Conrad novel, Heart of Darkness, which is actually set in Africa, not in Vietnam. It was planned to take 6 weeks to film. It took 16 months. It was plagued by difficulties throughout the filming, but it's been hugely lauded. Francis Ford Coppola was the director. It reflected the zeitgeist of the 70s and the US reaction to the recently ended Vietnam War, and Martin Sheen was in the lead role. Only 7 years later, Platoon came along, and it was to the 80s what Apocalypse Now was to the 70s, starring Charlie Sheen, the son of Martin, Oliver Stone, another lauded director, or very distinctive director, put his stamp on the movie, and it proved hugely popular, although veterans criticised it for lack of authenticity. And in another family resemblance, both movies have quiet voiceover narratives by the lead characters. Reason we're not covering them, that whilst they're set within a historic framework, the actual stories themselves are purely fictional. Okay, so that's 1 and 2. So when I said we're going to cover 11 films, it's kind of 12 really. So 3 down and 9 to go. Number 3 is 1997's Titanic. This focused on a romance between third-class passenger Jack Dawson, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and first-class passenger Rose DeWitt Bukater, Kate Winslet playing that role. When it was made, the movie was the most expensive ever made, having cost $200 million, although it certainly paid off. This movie has made over $2 billion at the box office. It's only beaten by Gone with the Wind when you take inflation into account. The major subplot to the main romance story is the conflict between Rose's fiancé, Cal Hockley, played by Billy Zane, and Jack Dawson, a Leonardo DiCaprio character, the everyman hero. And to the surprise of many in the audiences, and there's a spoiler alert here, Jack doesn't survive the famous sinking of the Titanic, but Rose does, and her much older self bookends the movie. Right at the beginning you see her and don't know who she is, and of course at the end it becomes clear. The movie was nominated for 12 Oscars, winning 11, which tied with Ben-Hur for the most wins by a single movie, and this has subsequently been tied again by Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King in 2003, which holds its own record in the sense it was only nominated for 11 and it won every single one. The reality, well, several historical characters are portrayed in the movie, including the ship's designer, the captain, and the chairman of White Star Line who ran the ship. So much of the movie, however, is based around fictional characters and the equally fictional romance that failed. That's the reason it failed to get across the HBH accuracy line. There's been a lot of criticism of the movie's portrayal of several real characters, including ship's officers Murdoch and Lightoller, both of whom received fulsome praise in the aftermath for their conduct and bravery. Murdoch didn't survive the sinking. Lightoller did, one of the very last people off. But by the way, this is another of these things of history being written by the victors or by those with access to media outlets. Has anybody heard of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff? I hadn't until a year or two ago, and we really should have done. It's the largest loss of life in any maritime disaster in recorded history. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff was an ocean liner being used by the Germans to evacuate civilians and some troops from across the Baltic Sea in the face of the Soviet advance in 1945. The Wilhelm Gustloff was torpedoed in January 1945 in the Baltic. Over 9,000 people died. We're not sure exactly how many. She was designed to carry 2,500. They stopped counting at 9,000. There may have been as many as 1,100 people on board. Not many people have heard of her, but then I suppose in the aftermath, considering the world view towards Nazi Germany, there wasn't a huge amount of sympathy at the time. Certainly the Soviets weren't going to advertise the fact that they torpedoed a ship. Yes, it had about 1,000 troops on, but the remainder were civilians. But we just don't hear about things like that. So that's Titanic, not really one for us. Number 4, we have mentioned before in the introduction to an earlier episode, and this is U-571, the 2000 movie, talking about or showing the story that a crew of an American submarine, S-33, they're sent to board a damaged U-boat, U-571 of the title, and capture an Enigma machine in 1942. It's got good cast. Matthew McConaughey, very capable actor. Bill Paxton, who of course we met in Apollo 13, sadly no longer with us. Harvey Keitel and John Bon Jovi, strangely star. And John Bon Jovi is actually killed in the movie. Although it was met with generally positive reviews on its release in America, in Britain there were howls of protest. Even British Parliament, with Tony Blair, called the movie an affront against British sailors, because as every British sailor, at least of my generation, was taught, HMS Bulldog captured the first Enigma machine in May 1941, about 6 months before the US joined the war. Except, as we mentioned before, that's not quite true either, because we did have an Enigma machine. It wasn't stolen, but it was recreated by Polish cryptographers in the 30s from intercepted German-coded messages. After the invasion of Poland by the Nazis, this machine was smuggled to the UK, where it gave the Allies a huge head start in their attempt to crack the German codes. So, you know, we teach ourselves what we think our people want to know, or should know, if that's... it's propagandised popular culture. Going back to U-571, Alex von Tunzelmann, in her Real History column in The Guardian, and that's real spelled R-E-E-L, very clever, she had a lovely line where she said the only honest thing about U-571 is its tagline, 9 men are about to change history. And they certainly did. Now, number 5 is probably been the most requested film that we felt unable to cover, and this is 1998's Saving Private Ryan. The opening scenes depicting the storming of Omaha Beach during D-Day are worth watching just on their own merit. They are horrific and shocking, and I remember watching it and thinking, as the front ramp on a landing craft drops and machine gun bullets immediately start killing American soldiers on board, you think, wow, you've joined up in the States, you've done a load of training, you've been shipped to the UK, you've done more training there, you've prepared, you've practiced, You've crossed the English Channel, and the first moment possible you get killed, and you just think, geez, what a waste. Having said that, if ever a war has been justified or an invasion been justified, this was probably it. So the story after the storming of D-Day is we focus on Army Ranger Captain John Miller, played by Tom Hanks, and he's tasked to take his 8-man squad and search for PFC James Ryan of the 101st Airborne. He's the last survivor of 4 brothers, the other 3 all having been killed in action in the preceding days and months. General George Marshall, the Chief of Staff back in Washington, has given the order to bring Private Ryan home, and he reads a letter from Abraham Lincoln to a mother during the US Civil War, where George Marshall quotes this letter, and this is a family who've lost 4 or 5, in the mother's case, sons. They lose Captain Miller and his squad. They lose most of the squad in the process, including near the film's conclusion Captain Miller himself, but they do succeed, and the final scene shows a much older James Ryan visiting the graves of the fallen men who came to rescue him. And I'm just going to play a clip now, and this is quoting from a letter that General Marshall himself wrote to Private Ryan's mother.
My dear Mrs. Ryan, it's with the most profound sense of joy that I write to inform you your son, Private James Ryan, is well and at this very moment on his way home from European battlefields. Reports from the front indicate James did his duty in combat with great courage and steadfast dedication, even after he was informed of the tragic loss your family has suffered in this great campaign to rid the world of tyranny and oppression.
So Private Ryan, or Saving Private Ryan, great movie, really, really good, just not quite close enough for our needs, because it was inspired by a story. The portrayal of the D-Day landings have been praised for their portrayal of storming a well-defended beach, but the rest of it is made up, and the inspiration came from the story of the Nyland family. These were 4 brothers from Tonawanda, New York. They joined the US forces during World War II. Edward Nyland was aircrew on a B-25 Mitchell bomber, and in May 1944 was shot down in the Far East and believed killed. Now, it did later transpire that he'd been captured, and he did survive Japanese POW camp and eventually returned home. But at the time of D-Day, they thought he was dead. Tech Sergeant Robert Nyland, 505th Para Infantry or Parachute Infantry, 82nd Airborne Division, he was killed on D-Day on the 6th of June, manning a machine gun whilst covering the withdrawal of his unit. A heroic volunteer. 2 other guys who volunteered with him, they survived. Unfortunately, Robert Nyland didn't. Preston Nyland, the 3rd brother, he was a 2nd Lieutenant in the 4th Infantry Division, and he was killed on the 7th of June near Utah Beach. Tech Sergeant Frederick Fritz Nyland served in H Company, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. He fought from D-Day for the first few days of the Normandy campaign. Then during some downtime he popped across to see the 82nd Airborne to see his brother Robert, only to find out that he'd been killed. When the authorities became aware of the brothers' losses, they shipped Fritz back to the US via England, and he served out the war as an MP in New York, and he died in 1983. For anyone who's watched Band of Brothers, and it is an excellent 10-part series following the exploits of Easy Company 506th Parachute Infantry, you may remember 2 characters from that unit, Warren Muck and Donald Malarkey. They were very, very good friends with Fritz Nyland, and both of those characters feature in the series prominently. So Fritz Nyland survived. This story was obviously heard by, whether it was Tom Hanks or Steven Spielberg, and I'm not sure, and that's where Saving Private Ryan was born from. But actually, nothing after the D-Day landing really is true. Number 6 is Perfect Storm. Now, this is strange because about half the film is actually based on fact. The movie tells a story of a fishing trawler, the Andrea Gale. Now, this is the element that isn't based on fact. Well, it's based on fact, but there's a lot of supposition goes into it. This fishing trawler, it's a swordfish fisher, It's captained by Billy Tyne, played by George Clooney. After a run of poor catches, they hit a good catch around Flemish Cap, further out to sea from the Grand Banks area off Massachusetts. But their ice machine breaks, and rather than risk ruining their catch, they decide to head for port, even though there's a big storm arriving across their path. Hit by huge seas and high winds, their antennas lost, so their sister ship calls in a mayday on their behalf. A US Air National Guard U-860 Payhawk helicopter launches in response but is unable to reach them, and being unable to perform an air-to-air refuel from a C-130 aircraft due to the turbulence of the wind, the helicopter eventually ditches, all but one of the crew being rescued by a Coast Guard cutter, a ship. Back aboard the Andrea Gale, they ride out the storm, and when the winds and seas ease, they think they've survived, only to realise that they're in the eye of the storm. When the storm regains force, she capsizes the ship and the crew are all lost. There's also a subplot about a yacht, the Mistral, which needs rescue by helicopters too, and a forecaster describes the storm as grade 5. Now, in reality, the helicopter portrayed in the movie did launch, but not to the Andrea Gale or the yacht Satori, which is renamed Mistral for the movie. But it was to rescue a lone Japanese sailor on a sailboat. Unable to effect a rescue, they did try to refuel mid-air, but poor visibility and turbulence prevented them achieving the procedures, so they did ditch. They did lose one crew member, but the others were rescued by a Coast Guard cutter, so that bit's pretty spot on. The Japanese sailor, I'm happy to report, was picked up by a nearby ship. The crew of the Satori, named the Mistral in the film, were also rescued by a helicopter, but this one was from the Coast Guard, and they didn't lower winching gear onto the deck as shown in the movie, but told the crew to jump overboard and rendezvous with a rescued diver, and they did all survive. As for the Andrea Gale, the skipper of their sister ship, Captain Linda Greenlaw, said she didn't send a mayday call on their behalf because those are not accepted by the Coast Guard, and unless they get a call directly from a vessel in distress, they will not initiate a search until 5 days after their due docking date. What actually happened to the Andrea Gale is just a complete mystery. We don't know. She was lost during this storm, so the main part of the film is pure speculation. The storm was described by a meteorological expert as a perfect storm, as two hurricanes converged, or two gales converged, but it didn't actually reach grade 5's level. The movie itself only has a 47% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but it did make a lot of money. It took in $328 million worldwide for a budget of $120 million. It is a good film. It's not great. There's a sort of lack of narrative continuity. It's almost like a series of vignettes about different people, and there's a bit of jumping backwards and forwards. And of course, it is quite sad. But it's it's a film worth watching if you haven't seen it.
Raindrops keep falling on my head, but that doesn't mean my eyes will soon be turning red. Crying's not for me, 'cause I'm never gonna stop the rain by complaining, because I'm free. Nothing's worrying me.
And yeah, of course, we're talking Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. 1969 movie following the exploits of Butch Cassidy, played by Paul Newman, the leader of the notorious Hole in the Wall gang, and his laconic hotshot sidekick, the Sundance Kid, played by Robert Redford. It's based near the close of the 19th century. They lead their group of outlaws in a train robbery, only to be pursued by a posse, which they only escape by leaping from a cliff top into a river. Realising that the US is too dangerous a place for them to stay, they relocate to Bolivia, where they try and go straight, but eventually return to their outlaw ways, and the final scenes show them pinned down by Bolivian troops, and we are led to believe that they are killed there. The final scene is the two of them bursting out from cover. I think Robert Redford's character, Sundance Kid's already wounded, and they're surrounded by these Bolivian troops who open fire, and the film kind of freezes. So, two of Hollywood's most charismatic actors lead a very entertaining movie. It's loosely based on the lives of Robert Leroy Parker aka Butch Cassidy, and Henry Longabout, aka the Sundance Kid. The Hole in the Wall gang did exist, but it was more a loose confederation of gangs who all used the hole in the wall, which was an easily defended canyon in Wyoming. There were stables, cabins and other buildings that the gangs used that they built there. The posse chasing Butch and Sundance were real, but they were raised by the Pinkerton Agency, a very effective private detective agency who became famous in their own right. And it is well established that the two outlaws did relocate to Bolivia, along with Etta Place, who was Sundance's lover partner. Etta soon returned to the US, realising that the boys were going back to their criminal ways. And whilst Bolivia claims the graves of Butch and Sundance for the town of San Vicente, where two robbers were cornered and killed, or according to the official Bolivian version, were cornered and shot themselves in 1908, there were many subsequent sightings of the pair, including accounts by members of Butch Cassidy / Robert Leroy Parker's family that he returned to the US under a pseudonym and lived until the late 1930s. The truth is likely to remain a mystery, but an exhumation of the graves said to be theirs in San Vicente proved to have no DNA connection to the outlaws. This doesn't mean that they aren't buried somewhere in the town, but it must remain case open for now. And of course the song you heard at the beginning was the Oscar-winning song Raindrops Are Falling on My Head, which is played during the film when Butch Cassidy is entertaining Etta and Sundance by riding around on a bicycle. If you haven't seen it, it's a great film. Of course, is music written by Ennio Morricone, famous film score director or film score composer, and that was the music for The Mission, directed by Roland Hoffe, and starring Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons and Liam Neeson. In the film, Robert De Niro plays Rodrigo Mendoza, who's a slave hunter who captures Native Americans in the area of northeastern Argentina, western Paraguay border. There's a Jesuit mission there, manned by Father Gabriel, played by Jeremy Irons, and Father Fielding, played by Liam Neeson. And they've converted many of the Guarani people who live in the area to Christianity. The mission is a place of sanctuary for the locals from slave raids by Spanish and Portuguese slavers. Mendoza, in a duel over a woman, kills his half-brother and goes to the mission to seek penance. After he's been there for a while, the locals, recognising him as a slaver, are very reluctant to befriend him at first, but he earns their trust. But then a Jesuit cardinal arrives to tell the Jesuit fathers that their mission is going to be closed because under the Treaty of Madrid, signed in 1750, the territory on which they live is being transferred to Portuguese control. The fathers are shocked, and Mendoza joins with Father Fielding in training the Guarani to defend their land against likely Portuguese attacks seeking to enslave the locals. Both Mendoza and Fielding are killed trying to defend the mission, whereupon Father Gabriel leads his congregation in a peaceful procession, only for the Portuguese soldiers to massacre them, only a few escaping and surviving. The score by Ennio Morricone has become a bit of a classic in its own right, and the movie was very well received by critics and those of the public who went to see it, but it barely broke even on its budget. It won 1 Oscar for Best Cinematography. It was nominated for 6 others. Now, our good friend and our theme music composer Jules Chisak absolutely loves this film and asked us to consider it, and even though the movie itself is a fictitious story and therefore it's not really one we can cover in a single episode, it is based on the experiences of a number of Jesuit missions that were meant to be closed down after Spain ceded what was known as Jesuit Paraguay to the Portuguese in the Treaty of Madrid. There were 7 of these missions affected. The Spanish offered 4,000 peso per mission in compensation, which equated to less than 1 peso per Guarani congregation member, on land that was worth well over 10 million pesos. Father Gabriel's character is based on Roque Gonzalez de Santa Cruz, a Jesuit and now a Paraguayan saint, who featured in a book called The Lost Cities of Paraguay by Father C.J. McNasby, who was also a consultant on the movie. The Treaty of Madrid and the subsequent plan to close the missions led to the Guarani War of 1754 to 1756, which both Spanish and Portuguese authorities met with soldiers and violence, killing thousands of the Guarani in the process. But the difficulties in implementing the treaty led to its annulment in 1761, and the now ruined Jesuit missions reverted to Spanish rule. The Spanish colonial rule in South and Central America is pretty much one of brutality, immense self-assured superiority, and the stripping of natural resources, especially mineral wealth. Yet for the Guarani to prefer to live under Spanish rule implies that the Portuguese were seen as much worse. Now, as I said, I don't know that much about this particular area at this particular time, and I am aware, whilst I'm being very critical of the Spanish and Portuguese South American empires, the British weren't any better in the subcontinent and in Africa and the Caribbean and everywhere else we went. And it is, of course, kind of fraught to try and apply today's moral standards to previous generations and previous eras. Anyway, moving on. The next film we're going to look at is JFK, Oliver Stone's 1991 movie starring Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney who investigated the assassination of President John Kennedy. Thwarted by authority time and again, he's eventually met by a mysterious man known as Mr. X, played by Donald Sutherland, who tells Garrison that there is indeed a conspiracy involving the Mafia, the CIA, the military-industrial complex, FBI, and the Vice President, Lyndon B. Johnson. Eventually, Garrison charges Clay Shaw, a businessman implicated in the conspiracy, with conspiring to murder the President, but Shaw is acquitted. And that's pretty much the movie. In reality, Jim Garrison did indeed investigate the murder of JFK. The DA was seen by some as a brave and tireless seeker of truth, and by others as a crackpot conspiracy theorist who abused his position in pursuit of pet theories. The factual summary of this movie is best summed up by renowned movie critic Roger Ebert. He says, "I don't have the slightest idea whether Oliver Stone knows who killed President John F. Kennedy. I have no opinion on the factual accuracy of his 1991 film JFK, but I don't think that's the point. This is not a film about the facts of the assassination, but about the feelings. JFK accurately reflects our national state of mind since November the 22nd, 1963. We feel the whole truth has not been told, that more than one shooter was involved, that somehow maybe the CIA, the FBI, Castro, the anti-Castro Cubans, the Mafia, or the Russians, or all of the above were involved. We don't know how, that's just how we feel." Kind of sums it up. Quite an entertaining film to watch. I saw it many years ago, but it doesn't really answer any questions. Okay, we're going to lighten the mood a little bit and tell the story of the movie Cool Runnings. Now, this 1993 movie tells the story, loosely based on true events, of the formation of a Jamaican bobsled team to compete in the 1988 Winter Olympics at Calgary. Irv Blitzer is played by John Candy, and he's a disgraced former Olympic champion bobsledder. He won a gold in the 60s, but then he was disqualified for cheating at subsequent Olympic Games, and he's become a bit of a sleazy local bookie living in Jamaica. He starts to train a team of track sprinters led by Darius Bannock, played by Leon Robinson. They make it to the Calgary Games, where everyone kind of treats them as a joke, and although they don't win a medal, they show some talent, and the movie suggests that they may have had at least a shot at the medals if their cheap second-hand sled hadn't broken on a fast run. The team lift the sled when it's broken and walk across the line carrying it to general applause. Now, this movie cost $14 million to make and made over $150 million at the box office, making it a huge success. It has a 75% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but when you take the critics out and just leave the audience reviews, it's 81%. So, pretty good ratings, and certainly a commercial success. Now, before we do the reality check on it. Let's just hear a little clip from the film.
Ready? Ready. Feel the rhythm. Feel the rhyme. Get on up. It's bobsled time. Cool running.
So the reality is the Jamaican Olympic bobsled team did indeed compete in the 1988 Olympics at Calgary, but that's pretty much all the Disney family comedy movie got right. The team weren't made up of track sprinters, but were actually chosen from the Jamaican Army, which is not that unusual. The British bobsled team is primarily made up of Army members. What happened was two American businessmen saw Jamaicans competing in pushcart derbies, and they thought, that actually looks like a similar skill set to bobsledding. Approached the Jamaican Olympic Committee, and after some efforts and some knockbacks, they were advised to approach the Jamaican Army, and that's how the team got formed. The first driver, I believe, I was going to say helmsman, but that seems wrong. Driver, I think. Dudley Stokes, known as Tal Stokes. He was one of the original 1988 team. And he says, I got into bobsledding because I was told to go. I was in the army at the time. The colonel made a suggestion to me, and because I was a captain, you do as you're told and obey orders. So that's how the team was formed. They had coaches from the US and Austria brought in to get the team up to speed, but as Stokes says, the first time he saw a bobsled on a proper track was September 1987. By February, he was competing in the Olympics. Far from being cold-shouldered by the established Winter Olympic nations, they were actually immensely popular, and they were made very welcome. They were lent kit, and they did crash on a fast run, and they were in a borrowed sled, but rather than lift the sled and carry it to the line, they just pushed it over the line and then lifted it off the track. The four-man team continued to compete until the 1998 Olympics, Dudley Stokes leading each time, and their highest placing was 14th in the 1994 Lillehammer Games, which is pretty good because there's normally about 35-36 teams that enter. Then the two-man bob competed up until 2002 with Winston Watts driving, and then they failed to qualify for the next two Olympics, but in 2014 at Sochi, Watts returned to the scene with teammate Marvin Dixon. The highest placement for the two-man bob was 28th in the 2002 Games in Utah. And I'm sad to say that the rhyme we heard earlier, feel the rhythm and feel the rhyme, get on up, it's bobsled time, was, according to Tal Stokes, was just made up for the movie. Finally, and this is one that I guess most people will understand why we can't really dedicate a whole episode to it. It's in 1993. The 2006 movie, directed by Paul Greengrass, of Bourne trilogy fame, tells a supposed story of the events aboard United Airlines Flight 93 on the 11th September 2001. I'm not going to go into the plot in any great depth, but the story evolves as the 9/11 attacks are in progress, and we see the passengers aboard United 93 being hijacked, and then their realisation that the intention of the hijackers was to use the aircraft as a missile. The passengers decide that if they're going to die, they'll do it on their own terms and not the hijackers, and with one passenger able to fly a plane, there was always a glimmer hope of survival. They attack the hijackers, but in the fight for control of the plane, we see it plunge into a Pennsylvania field, and all aboard are killed. The film received high critical praise. It still holds a 91% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, although some viewers have said they found it profoundly disturbing. It was also a commercial success, costing $15 million to make and taking $75 million at the box office. Reality, without delving into the murky world of 9/11 conspiracy theories, it's enough to know that the basic facts of the day are covered, but most of the onboard action is supposition or pure fiction. Although the cockpit voice recordings have not been released, the transcripts of them have. There's still doubt as to whether the passengers managed to actually get into the cockpit, or if the hijackers, realising that the cockpit was about to be breached and they imminently they were going to be attacked by the passengers, they crashed the plane as a last resort. The passenger list of the plane does reveal some interesting characters, though. There were ex-military, ex-police officers, sportsmen and women, and business leaders. And Todd Beamer, whose voice is believed to have made the famous "Let's Roll" comment that was picked up by a mobile phone, he'd hoped to play professional baseball until injury ended that ambition. Not really much more I can say about it. I've seen the film. I saw the film not long after it came out, and it is certainly riveting. It's hard to say more than that. So those are the movies of the ones that got away. Now, we do think we're probably going to get a Supplementary 3 out of this, or it might be Supplementary 4 by the time we do it, but a part 2 of the ones that got away. So if anyone can think of a film they're thinking, yeah, they're probably not going to do it for real, or if there's just a film you'd like us to cover, do please send in hosts@historybyhollywood.com, or if you want to email specifically me or Andrew, it's andrew@historybyhollywood.com or martin@historybyhollywood.com. On Twitter, we are @historybyhwood, all one word. We couldn't fit the Ollie into Hollywood, so it's Hwood. And on Facebook, we have a Facebook page, facebook.com/historybyhollywood. Before we finish, all I'd like to do is just very quickly, and I'm going to curtail my planned speech because I'm approaching the 1 hour mark, movies that should be made. And I do find it staggering. The more I'm exposed to podcasts like Uncivil, our conversations with Vincent Schilling at the Indian County Times and Native American issues, the email from Susan Jones talking about Tuganini, someone I'd never heard of, makes you realise that there's a whole hidden history out there. And I know there are podcasts dedicated to these sorts of things, but I'm thinking about movie makers. Now, I doubt that, Ridley Scott or Steven Spielberg are listening to this podcast, but maybe someone who's something to do with the movie industry or has an ambition to write a screenplay is, why are there no mainstream Western films about Mustafa Kemal Ataturk? I mean, there are probably a reasonably large proportion of people who aren't sure who he is. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was born Mustafa, then he was given the nickname Kemal by a school teacher, which stuck, so he became Mustafa Kemal. He was a Turkish army officer during the First World War, the end of the Ottoman Empire. He commanded the 19th Infantry Division on the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli Peninsula, and was very highly respected by the Allies he was fighting against, and he was largely given credit for the successful defence of the Gallipoli Peninsula. After the war, he joined the Young Turks, which was a group really trying to forge an independent country out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. He believed in a secular government and freedom of religious expression, but for all religions, emancipation of women, democracy, although he wasn't the most democratic of people himself. It's almost like that, no, you can vote when I'm gone, but at the moment I'm the best person for the job, trust me. But basically, by force of personality, he forged what we now know as Turkey. And I can't find any movies about him. Not from our perspective. There may well be Turkish ones. In fact, there almost probably was. Almost certainly are. Another character is Tito. Josip Broz, who became known as Tito. It's one of his pseudonyms when he was a member of the Communist Party. Very similar to Ataturk. He forged the nation of Yugoslavia. He founded or ran a partisan group during the Second World War, at one stage pinning down 4 German divisions. He was a Croat, but his father was a Croat, his mother was Slovenian, but most of his partisan army was Serbs, and after the war he basically built Yugoslavia and very successfully steered a path between the Soviet sphere of influence and the Western European American NATO sphere of influence, remaining largely independent. Fascinating country. Unfortunately, a bit like Alexander the Great, he didn't really lay any groundwork for a successor. Hence, we had the Bosnian War and the conflict after Tito's death. But again, fascinating character. Now, the next one we have discussed before is Xenophon and the Anabasis. I mean, if you want to do a sword and sandals epic, how good does this get? 10,000 Greek mercenaries march about 1,000 miles into Persia to support Cyrus, the younger brother of Artaxerxes II. Cyrus is trying to usurp his brother's throne from the King of Kings of Persia. In the first battle, he gets killed, and his army collapses, and the 10,000 Greek mercenaries have to conduct a fighting withdrawal all the way from near Babylon to the Black Sea. Look on a map, that is a bit of a long walk, without being attacked all the way. We're very fortunate, from a historical point of view, that one of the people on board this journey was Xenophon, not only a soldier, but a historian, a philosopher, and a prolific author. And his work has survived down to this day. It's called Anabasis, which in Greek literally meant march up country, although no thanks to him, it's also a Greek word for a difficult military withdrawal. And it's been suggested that 2 generations later, Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, got his idea of invading Persia because of Xenophon's experience. And he thought, right, a well-trained and equipped Greek army could actually conquer Persia. And of course, Alexander did exactly that. Finally, there are no major movies about the gunpowder plot. Now, I do understand this is a very British thing. 5th of November, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. Guy Fawkes, we still burn guys on bonfires on November the 5th, and we have fireworks to represent the unsuccessful plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament. Kit Harington, better known to most people as Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, has just completed I think a 3 or 4 part miniseries on BBC. I haven't seen it yet. But I mean, this is begging for a movie to be made about it, because you could even do it as a dark comedy, the plotters being hilariously incompetent. I mean, if you're planning to blow up the King and the Houses of Parliament, it's probably a really good idea not to tell anyone that doesn't absolutely need to know. Like, don't just have a few beers in an inn and tell all the people in there, including the landlord, who has royalist sympathies. So bit of a cock up. Guy Fawkes himself, turns out he was basically just the man who was willing to die if he got caught, and he was going to go in and light the fuse. But definitely needs a film being made about it. Okay, the next one that got away, whenever we do that, probably in a few months' time, we are thinking in that will probably be Kelly's Heroes, the Clint Eastwood and Donald Sutherland and Telly Savalas movie about a tank crew, or a group of tank crews that decide to steal some Nazi gold in the Second World War. Zodiac, which may actually qualify to have a real one. This is about the Zodiac killer in California. Never been caught, serial killer, never been solved. I haven't seen the movie, I need to do some more research. Last King of Scotland, great film, but the main character is entirely fictitious. It's based on the writings of someone who actually left Uganda long before the raid on Entebbe and Amin's final sort of lunatic days. Battle of the Bulge, historically based around historical events, the German offensive into the Ardennes in 1944, but again, all the main characters are fictitious as far as I'm aware. And the other one is Fly Away Home, which starred Jeff Daniels, amongst others, and it's based on a story of a French ornithologist who worked out that after 2 mild winters, there were geese in Scandinavia that had basically forgotten how to migrate. And in a microlight, he teaches them, because he realises when the cold winters come, it's going to wipe them out. Now, I've actually was flying a helicopter at an air display where we had this guy come along, and he's got some Canada geese, which is not the breed that he successfully retaught to migrate, but they were geese he trained for displays to raise money for his foundation. Of course, Disney got hold of it, and Jeff Daniels, it's suddenly set in Canada and the United States, so we'll have a look at that, but I suspect it's not something we'll do a full episode on. That's it for now, folks. Now, to see us out, I'm going to just play the other Civil War tune. Thank you so much for listening, and we will speak to you again in a fortnight's time, where Andrew will be back, and we will be covering the epic 1960s film with Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis and Laurence Olivier and a wonderful cast telling the story of Spartacus. Thank you very much, and goodbye.